There is this fascinating and honestly almost delusional ritual that happens right before every single trip.
Oh, I think I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right, like you're standing there in your bedroom, just staring down at an open suitcase.
Yeah.
And you're folding your shirts into those like perfect, mathematically precise little squares. You're tucking your socks inside your shoes just to maximize every single bit of cubic volume.
It's all about Tetris at that point.
Exactly. It's luggage Tetris. You curate this tiny, highly controlled environment, you zip it up, and you basically tell yourself, there it is, I'm ready. I have completely mastered the universe.
It really is the ultimate illusion of containment, isn't it?
It totally is.
We have this deep-seated psychological urge to believe that the sprawling, completely unpredictable experience of, venturing out into the unknown, that it can somehow be neatly categorized and contained inside a piece of 22-inch rolling luggage.
Right, because it's deeply comforting to feel that level of control.
Exactly, it's an anchor.
But the reality is, the absolute second you pull out of your driveway, the second you actually step over the threshold of your home and insert yourself into the whole machinery of transit, that perfectly organized suitcase becomes completely irrelevant.
Yeah, the rules change entirely.
They do. Because the reality of travel isn't binary. It's not just about what fits in a bag and what doesn't. You were immediately thrown into a psychological landscape that is murky, it's chaotic, and it's frankly completely out of your control.
You basically transition from being the architect of your own reality to just a participant in a reality you have zero dictate over.
Which is terrifying and thrilling. And that brings us to today. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are wading directly into those murky waters.
Right into it.
We are. We're looking at the mechanics, the philosophy, and really the underlying psychology of travel. And the lens we are using to examine all of this is hiding inside what I can only describe as a brilliant little Trojan horse.
Yeah, the source material for this is wildly unexpected.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because on its surface, today's source is literally a C2 advanced English listening practice lesson.
Which, is such a weird place to find profound philosophical insights about the human condition.
Right. You'd expect grammar drills. But if you strip away the vocabulary lessons and the conversational idioms they are trying to teach, you find this incredibly nuanced exploration.
It's basically a series of essays masked as a language lesson.
Exactly. It details what it really means to leave your sanctuary, what it means to physically and mentally collide with the unknown, and then ultimately what it means to return to your sanctuary as a fundamentally altered human being.
The authors essentially use the mechanics of the English language to map out the mechanics of human transformation. It's super clever.
It's brilliant. So that is our mission for today. We're going to decode the entire life cycle of a journey for you.
From start to finish.
Yes. We're going to map out the literal physical stages of travel. From the moment the tires leave the driveway to the moment you put your key back in your front door. And we'll parallel that with the psychological stages embedded in the source text.
Because it doesn't really matter the scale of the trip, right?
Not at all. Whether you are planning a massive multi-month trek across 3 different continents, or you're literally just throwing a duffel bag in the trunk for a weekend 2 towns over, the underlying mechanisms are exactly the same.
The psychology doesn't care about the mileage.
Exactly.
Right.
And understanding these mechanisms is going to completely change the way you view your very next departure.
Well, let's start right at the threshold then. Because the source text begins exactly at that moment of transition. It opens with this dialogue between a husband and a wife who are literally in the process of leaving their house.
Right. And what jumps out at you immediately is the highly specific vocabulary of departure. It's almost like they're speaking a distinct dialect.
It really is. You're ensuring the car is packed.
Yes. You're putting the heavy items in the trunk. You have to strategize how to navigate the freeway and the highway tolls.
You're establishing the entire hierarchy of the vehicle, who is the designated driver, who gets to be the passenger.
And then, of course, you have to secure the absolute most important necessity of all the munchies.
Oh, the munchies are critical. But see, the source points out that those snacks, the potato chips, the cookies, the chocolate bars, they aren't actually just calories.
No, they're emotional support snacks.
Exactly. In the context of the journey, they act as pacifiers. They are these small, highly predictable comforts that you're deliberately bringing into an unpredictable environment.
Right, because if everything goes wrong, at least I have a Snickers bar. But looking past the literal physical items in the car, The source really hones in on the idioms of readiness.
The language we use to boldly declare that we are prepared.
Yes. Phrases like, we've got all our bases covered, or people saying they're all set, or all ready to go, and finally, that big declaration of intent. Let's get going.
Which is fascinating because if we put those specific phrases under a microscope, they reveal a whole lot about our mental state right at the point of departure.
Oh, totally. Like saying, we've got our bases covered.
Right. A phrase that literally borrows from the highly structured, very rule-bound game of baseball. Using it in this context is essentially a verbal talisman.
A talisman? How so?
Well, the source gives the example of doing the classic pat-down check for your keys, your wallet, and your passport. When you verbalize out loud that you have these things, when you say bases are covered, you aren't just communicating logistics to your partner, you are actively trying to ward off separation anxiety.
Oh, wow. So that little pre-departure checklist we all do out loud, it isn't actually about logistics at all. It's a coping mechanism.
Precisely. You are standing right on the boundary line between your private domain, where you control absolutely everything, and the public chaos, where you control absolutely nothing.
That is a terrifying boundary to cross.
It is. So running through that verbal checklist gives you the necessary courage to physically cross that boundary. It's a mantra. You recite it over and over to convince yourself that you have somehow anticipated every possible failure point.
And the source illustrates the sheer fragility of that courage almost immediately. It has this brilliant, almost sitcom-level comedic timing.
Yeah, the transition is so abrupt.
Right. So the husband delivers the grand mantra. He says, well, let's get going then. I love road trips. He has fully asserted his dominance over the situation. He is the master of the itinerary.
He's ready to conquer the highway.
Exactly. And then the very next line from the wife is, do you think we can make a pit stop?
And the husband is just entirely baffled by this. He protests, but we've only been on the road for 10 minutes.
Because in his mind, the logic of the itinerary is absolutes. They just left the house. A stop makes zero logical sense on paper.
But she replies, I know, but I forgot to go to the bathroom before we left. Which just completely shatters his illusion of a perfect timeline.
It's so real, though. The body literally vetoes the mind's itinerary.
It does. And it's the perfect encapsulation of the friction of travel. You have this idealized, hyper-logical plan. The bases are covered, the trunk is packed, the trajectory is locked in. And then within exactly 10 minutes, messy, biological human reality rebels against the plan.
So the journey doesn't actually begin when the car starts.
No, the journey begins the moment you are forced to accept that you are no longer in control.
I love that. And the source also dives into the physical environment where this realization usually takes place, the car itself. It offers these two heavily contrasting anecdotes about the great road trip.
Yeah, the two different archetypes of driving.
Right. First, we have Emma, who recounts her childhood family trips. And she describes being in the car, driving 8 hours a day, pushing way up into northern Canada, just driving relentlessly and then sleeping outside, making campfires at night.
Which is a very specific, almost endurance-based model of travel. It's really about conquering the geography.
Right, it's about the grit. But then you have John, who offers his completely opposite version. His road trips involve packing a car full of his buddies and just driving to Las Vegas.
The destination is just an excuse.
Exactly. The focus for him isn't the endurance of the landscape. It's the simple fact that they're just a bunch of guys in a car talking, hanging out. They're essentially treating the vehicle like a rolling living room.
This contrast is so great because it brilliantly highlights the sociology of confined spaces. If you think about it, the physical dimensions of a car do not change.
Right. The trunk is the trunk.
The passenger seat is always the passenger seat. But the psychological geography of the vehicle is entirely dictated by the specific people you put inside it.
Yeah, Emma notes in the source with like a bit of lingering childhood exhaustion. She says, maybe 8 hours in a car is a little too long.
And John immediately counters with 8 hours in a car is not really that boring with all your friends.
It completely depends on the dynamic. An 8-hour drive to northern Canada with your parents and your annoying siblings, that is an environment defined by rigid familial hierarchy, forced physical proximity, and let's be real, likely a whole lot of silent tension.
Oh, definitely. The car in that scenario acts as a literal pressure cooker for any existing family dynamics. You can't escape it.
But switch that to an 8-hour drive to Las Vegas with your peers, and suddenly it is an environment of horizontal equality. The social rules are totally looser. The vehicle becomes this fun incubator for bonding rather than a crucible of endurance.
It really proves that the physical destination is almost secondary to the social ecosystem that you bring with you.
But of course, eventually you do have to actually figure out where you're going.
Unfortunately, yes. The planning phase.
Yeah, and getting from your driveway to that destination, especially if it involves crossing international borders rather than just crossing state lines, that requires a monumental cognitive effort before you ever even leave the house.
You're moving from the lexicon of departure right into the architecture of preparation.
The architecture of preparation. I like that. It's the invisible foundation that dictates absolutely everything that follows.
It really is. And the very first step in building that architecture is the binary choice of destination.
Right. Where are we actually going?
The source frames this beautifully as a choice between completely different sensory diets. So, do you want the big city, the tall buildings, the concrete, the busy streets, just the sheer density of humanity, or do you want the opposite? The small villages, the mountains, the quiet beaches, the expansive empty landscapes.
So it's basically a choice between massive overstimulation and intentional understimulation.
Exactly. And when we choose a destination, we are, without realizing it, diagnosing our own psychological deficit at that moment in time.
Wait, diagnosing our deficit? What do you mean?
Well, think about it. If your daily life is very isolating, very quiet, maybe you work from home alone, you might suddenly crave the intense friction and the overwhelming sensory input of a place like Tokyo or New York.
Oh, I see. You want the chaos because you lack it.
Right. You want to feel small in a massive crowd. But if your daily life is characterized by urban burnout, endless meetings, and constant demands on your attention, you are going to crave the vast, silent emptiness of a mountain range.
You are literally choosing the environment that will shock your specific system back into equilibrium.
Precisely. And then layered right on top of that sensory choice is the climate choice, warm and sunny versus cold and snowy.
Which basically dictates the entirety of your logistical preparation from there on out. And this is where the source text gets incredibly granular. It presents this whole checklist that goes way, way beyond just deciding how to fold your shirts and socks.
Yeah, it gets into the heavy logistical bureaucracy of travel.
The sheer paperwork, visas, and then the absolute terror of the 6-month passport rule.
Oh, that catches so many people.
It's the worst. The requirement that your passport has to be valid for at least 6 months beyond your planned return date. It feels like a trap.
It does. And then you have to navigate the complete labyrinth of airline baggage weight and size limits, which change depending on the carrier, and seem specifically designed to penalize you.
Absolutely. And we can't forget the financial logistics. The source talks about the need to notify your bank in advance so their fraud algorithms don't instantly freeze your accounts the very moment you try to buy a bottle of water in a different hemisphere.
Because there's nothing worse than being stranded with a locked card.
Right. You have to figure out exchanging cash, understanding the global variations and where credit cards are even accepted.
Yeah.
It's a lot. But what I found really brilliant in this specific section of the source was the tension it highlights between digital reliance and analog survival.
Yes. The offline maps versus the notebook debate.
Exactly. The text strongly advises downloading offline maps on your smartphone. Because let's face it, you will, without a doubt, find yourself standing on some random street corner with zero cell reception.
Right. The offline map is your digital safety net.
But then, almost in the exact same breath, the source insists that you must also pack a physical paper notebook and a pen. It tells you to write down your hotel address, the local emergency numbers, the contact information for your embassy.
Because a smartphone with a dead battery is just a heavy, completely useless piece of glass in your pocket.
Yep, it's a brick.
Relying entirely on digital infrastructure when you are in a foreign, unfamiliar environment is a massive, massive vulnerability. The analog notebook is the ultimate fail-safe. If the grid goes down or you drop your phone in a puddle, the pen and paper still work.
But honestly, when you look at the entirety of this preparation, phase packing the climate-appropriate clothes, securing those specific blister-preventing shoes, assembling a custom first aid kit, researching all the cultural customs.
Figuring out where you are actually allowed to take photographs and where it is deeply offensive.
Doing all of that feels like taking on a second full-time job. It's utterly exhausting before you even leave.
It is exhausting, there is no denying that, but it serves a really critical psychological function. Every single item you manage to check off that massive list is an act of cognitive offloading.
Cognitive offloading.
Yes. You are essentially future-proofing your mental state.
Okay, you need to explain that mechanism to me. How does checking a baggage weight limit 3 weeks in advance future-proof my mind?
Okay, think about the very moment of arrival at your destination. You are exhausted, you are jet-lagged, and you are being completely bombarded with unfamiliar sensory input. Your brain's processing capacity, your mental RAM, is already maxed out just trying to take in the new environment.
Right, just trying to figure out which way is north.
Exactly. If, in that overwhelming moment, you also have to figure out how to convert currency to pay a taxi driver, or you have to frantically search for a pharmacy because you didn't bring bandages, or you are stressing about how to say hello without deeply offending the receptionist, your cognitive load crashes.
You just hit a wall.
You enter a state of severe distress. By doing all of that exhausting administrative preparation weeks in advance, you are systematically solving problems for your future self.
Oh, I see.
You free up your mental RAM so that when you finally arrive, you can actually observe the culture instead of just desperately trying to survive it.
Okay, that makes sense. But this is exactly where I have to heavily challenge the philosophy of the checklist.
All right, let's hear it.
If we optimize absolutely everything, if we research every single neighborhood on Google Street View, memorize the transit map, schedule all our meals, and build this impenetrable fortress of preparation, don't we kind of murder the very soul of travel?
You think it kills the spontaneity?
I do. Doesn't a heavily planned trip just devolve into an administrative exercise? You aren't really exploring at that point. You're just executing a pre-written itinerary.
That is the classic, very romantic argument against planning. And it's a completely valid concern. The fear is always that structure destroys serendipity. But the reality of human psychology is actually the exact opposite. True spontaneity, and I mean the kind of spontaneity that leads to meaningful exploration rather than just blind panic, it requires a foundation of safety. We can call that foundation your scaffolding.
Scaffolding? Like on a building?
Exactly. Think of a skyscraper under construction. The scaffolding isn't the building itself, it's temporary. But it is what allows the workers to move around freely, take risks, and build the actual structure without falling to their deaths.
Okay.
Preparation is your psychological scaffolding. If you know you have a warm bed secured for the night, and you know you have emergency cash hidden in your shoe, and you know how to navigate the local subway system to get back to your base camp, you feel secure.
The basics are handled.
Yes. And because you feel secure, you suddenly have the psychological bandwidth to wander down that strange, unlit alleyway that isn't mentioned anywhere in your guidebook. You have the confidence to say yes to a random dinner invitation from a local shop owner.
Because if things go completely wrong, the scaffolding catches you.
Exactly. If you drop into a totally foreign city with zero planning, no map, and no accommodation booked, you aren't being spontaneous. You are in a primitive survival state.
You're just a stray cat at that point.
Right. Your entire day will be consumed by the baseline anxiety of securing your basic physiological needs, food, and shelter. You won't even notice the beautiful architecture because you are too busy aggressively looking for a safe place to sleep. Good preparation doesn't kill the adventure. It provides the psychological safety net that makes the high-wire active adventure even possible.
Okay, you've completely reframed that for me. The itinerary isn't a prison. It's the anchor that lets you safely drift without drowning.
Beautifully put.
And once that anchor is forged, once all the preparation is finally done and you step out of your house, you enter a phase of travel that the source text treats with a surprising amount of reverence. You enter transit.
Ah, yes, the liminal space.
Yes. The source goes really out of its way to frame the journey itself, not as some miserable, annoying obstacle between you and your vacation, but as a unique, fully self-contained psychological environment. And it breaks down the specific atmospheres created by different modes of transport.
Because each mode of transit imposes a completely different set of rules on the human psyche.
Exactly. So let's start with airplanes. The text definitely acknowledges the stress of airports, the whole security theater, the massive crowds, the genuine nervousness that first-time flyers experience.
The pat-downs, the taking off the shoes.
It's all terrible. But it highlights that once you are actually on a long flight in your seat, you are gifted this massive block of uninterrupted time. You read a book, you watch 3 terrible movies, you just stare out the window at the clouds.
You see, an airplane is one of the very last true sanctuaries from modern expectation. It is essentially a pressurized tube of forced surrender.
Forced surrender. I love that phrasing.
Think about it. You have no cellular connection to your daily obligations. You cannot physically leave the tube. You cannot affect the speed of the journey in any way. In our normal, everyday lives, we are completely addicted to agency and optimization.
We always have to be doing something productive.
Right. But on a plane, your agency is completely stripped from you. You are essentially a piece of cargo being shipped across the globe.
And that profound lack of agency is actually what causes the deep relaxation.
Precisely. The anxiety of choice is completely gone. You just exist in this weird state of suspended animation.
Then the source contrasts that flying experience with trains. It points out the relaxing forward movement, the rhythmic clacking sound of the tracks, the dining areas where you can sit and eat a meal while watching mountains and rivers just sort of slide by outside the window.
If airplanes sever your connection to the Earth, trains provide a continuous, unbroken geographical narrative.
The narrative.
Yeah. When you fly from, say, London to Tokyo, you essentially teleport. You close your eyes in one reality and you open them 12 hours later in a completely different one. The human brain really struggles to comprehend the sheer distance of that jump.
Because there's no visual proof of the distance.
Exactly. But on a train, you witness every single mile. You watch the topography slowly warp and change. You see the architecture of the tiny towns slowly shift as you move across borders. You maintain a very physical, grounded connection to the actual scale of the planet.
The source also brings up buses, noting them not just as an affordable option, but as a way that uniquely allows you to observe the daily, highly granular life of an area. And boats, emphasizing the peaceful rhythm of the ways, and that really unique perspective of looking back at a city skyline from the water rather than from within it.
What unites all these different modes of transit is the sociological concept of the non-place.
A non-place.
Yeah. A transit vehicle, whether it's a plane, train, or bus, is an environment that holds no history of its own and no permanent identity. It exists for one reason only, to facilitate movement. And because you are temporarily existing in a non-place, the standard social rules of your daily life are completely suspended.
Oh, which perfectly explains the specific phenomenon the source mentions. It talks about the tendency to strike up these incredibly deep conversations with complete strangers while traveling. It points out that talking to the person next to you can lead to valuable travel tips or even like new lifelong friendships.
Think about the strained artificial intimacy of sitting literally shoulder to shoulder with a total stranger on a bus or a plane for 6 straight hours.
It's weirdly intimate.
Right. If you were at a coffee shop back in your hometown, you would never, ever turn to the person sitting at the next table and randomly reveal your deepest life anxieties.
You'd be asked to leave.
Exactly. But in transit, you are both completely untethered. You are existing outside of your normal social hierarchies. The person sitting next to you doesn't know your boss. They don't know your family. They don't know about your past failures.
You're a blank slate.
You can present an entirely new version of yourself, or paradoxically, you can reveal your most authentic, vulnerable self, knowing full well you will likely never see this person ever again. Transit creates this temporary, magical, judgment-free vacuum.
To me, this entire phase of transit acts as a psychological waiting room. When you are sitting in seat 14B at 35,000 feet, you are no longer the deeply stressed out person who was frantically packing the suitcase yesterday.
No, that person is gone.
But you also haven't yet become the explorer who will be navigating a foreign language tomorrow. You're just suspended between identities. The bubble of transit provides this absolutely necessary quiet buffer zone for your brain to transition from the known to the unknown.
It is the deep breath right before the plunge.
But as we know, the reality of a bubble is that it always pops. And the second the plane wheels actually hit the tarmac, or the second those train doors slide open, the peaceful waiting room vanishes instantly. And you are shoved, without any gentle transition whatsoever, into the sensory overload and the absolute shock of arrival.
The plunge into the freezing cold water.
It really is. The source text describes this exact moment so vividly. Arriving in a new place is an immediate, overwhelming flood of raw data. You step out of the station and you are hit with new languages, entirely different conventions of how people dress, unfamiliar street sounds, and a totally different physical rhythm to the way human bodies move through the space.
It's a wall of noise.
And you don't get the luxury of just sitting on a nice park bench to process it all. Your immediate, highly pressing task is survival logistics. You have to navigate away from the transit hub, figure out a completely incomprehensible public transport map, or hail a rideshare just to reach your accommodation.
The cognitive spike in this specific moment is immense.
Oh, I bet.
You are transitioning violently from the completely passive, surrendered state of the airplane seat into a hyperactive, panic state of environmental decoding. Absolutely everything requires intense processing.
Nothing is automatic.
Nothing. The street signs are in a different alphabet. The color of the taxis might mean something different than what you're used to. Even the spatial awareness required to walk down the sidewalk without constantly colliding with locals is different. Your brain is suddenly burning calories at an astonishing rate just trying to keep you physically safe.
Which perfectly explains why the text focuses so heavily on the profound psychological relief of finally checking into your hotel or your hostel. It describes the simple, mundane acts of taking a shower and unpacking your bag as the true beginning of the travel experience.
Because that hotel room represents the immediate restoration of a predictable microenvironment.
You get a little bit of control back.
Exactly. When you close and lock that hotel door, you instantly block out the overwhelming sensory data of the street. Taking a hot shower washes off the literal physical grime of transit, yes, but it also washes off the spike of adrenaline from the arrival.
They're washing off the panic.
And by unpacking your bag, putting your clothes in the drawers, putting your toothbrush by the sink, you are marking your territory. You are establishing a safe zone. You have successfully anchored yourself in the new reality.
But the sanctuary of the hotel room is temporary. You can't stay in there forever. Eventually, you have to step back outside and actually face the city.
And the source creates these really beautiful, highly contrasting snapshots of what you might encounter when you finally do step out.
Right.
You might step out into chaotic, incredibly noisy streets filled with blaring car horns and loud music. Or you might just turn a corner and suddenly find yourself in a quiet, narrow alleyway where the only sound is birdsong. You move rapidly from the overwhelming bright colors of a busy market directly into the sudden, eerie peace of an empty park.
The physical and mental toll of this kind of exploration is just massive. The text acknowledges the heavy weight of jet lag, that bizarre, nauseating sensation of your internal biological clock violently clashing with the actual position of the sun.
It's a physical illness, really.
It is. And adjusting to a climate that might be 50 degrees different from what you left yesterday. And then the profound challenge of simply finding your very first meal.
Oh, the first meal is always the hardest.
Staring at a menu where you recognize absolutely zero words, trying to secure basic bodily nourishment when you are already running completely on fumes.
This phenomenon, this deep, bone-weary exhaustion of the first few days of a trip is something every single traveler experiences. But the underlying mechanics of why it happens are fascinating.
Yeah, let's dig into that. Why is it that just walking out of a hotel on day one and trying to order a simple cup of coffee feels like trying to solve a high-stakes calculus equation? Why is it simultaneously the most exhausting and the most thrilling thing in the world?
It all comes down to how predictive coding works in the human brain.
Predictive coding.
Yes. When you are at home, in your normal routine, your brain operates almost entirely on autopilot. Over the years, it has built highly efficient, highly accurate, predictive models for your specific environment. You don't have to actively think about how to turn the knob on your front door, or how to navigate your daily commute, or what the ambient noise of your neighborhood means.
Right. I can literally drive to the grocery store and not remember a single second of the drive once I pull into the parking lot.
Exactly. Your predictive models successfully handled the entire drive. Your brain predicts the sensory input, confirms it, and then just filters out 90% of it to save valuable energy.
It's a battery-saving mode.
But when you step out of a hotel in Marrakech or Kyoto, your predictive models are instantly rendered completely useless. Your brain can no longer predict what is going to happen next in the environment. The autopilot forcefully shuts down.
So you have to manually drive.
Suddenly, you have to consciously, actively process every single piece of incoming data. You have to analyze the speed of the unfamiliar traffic. You have to read the body language of the person walking toward you. You have to evaluate the smell coming from the street food cart. You even have to figure out the specific cultural protocol for simply handing a piece of paper money to a cashier.
It's a state of complete hyper-awareness.
Yes. Your brain is essentially working overtime, rapidly forging entirely new neural pathways to build new predictive models on the fly. That biological process, that neuroplasticity, is incredibly energy intensive. That is where the exhaustion comes from.
Wow.
But crucially, it is also the source of the thrill. Because you cannot operate on autopilot, you are forced into a state of absolute uncompromising presence. You are existing entirely in the current exact second. You aren't worrying about the past, you aren't stressing about the future. You are just desperately trying to order the coffee.
So the sheer exhaustion isn't a sign that you are failing at travel. It is literal, physical proof that your brain is currently expanding to accommodate the new culture.
It is the biological cost of admission. And once you push through that initial friction, once your brain starts to finally establish a baseline understanding of the new environment, the exhaustion starts to lift. And that is when you transition into the active exploration phase of the culture.
Right. And the source refers to this as engaging with the menu of culture. It notes that the instinct for almost everyone, naturally, is to start with the famous landmarks.
Of course. You go to the Eiffel Tower, you walk the main historical avenues of Rome, you visit the Golden Pavilion in Kyoto.
The monumental architecture, the giant things you have seen in textbooks and on screens for your entire life. And standing in front of them definitely does evoke amazement. But the text makes a really critical pivot here.
It does. It pushes you deeper.
It argues that if you truly want to understand a place, you cannot just stop at the monuments. You have to plunge into the local residential neighborhoods. You have to observe the mundane, everyday reality of how people actually live, how they buy their groceries, how they commute to work.
You know, I often think of navigating a city's culture like trying to understand acoustic resonance.
Acoustic resonance. Okay, walk me through that analogy.
Think of a really grand, complex piece of orchestral music. The landmarks, the Eiffel Tower, the Colosseum, the Statue of Liberty. They are the booming, low-frequency bass notes.
The big hits.
Right. They are incredibly loud. They physically vibrate your chest. They are completely impossible to miss, and everyone who hears them in exactly the same way.
Yeah.
But a song that is only bass notes is completely hollow. The residential neighborhoods, the hidden winding alleyways, the tiny local bakeries, those are the high-frequency notes. They are the delicate, complex, intricate sounds that actually give the music its unique texture and its signature identity. If you only visit the landmarks, you are only hearing the bass. You completely miss the actual music of the city.
That is a phenomenal way to put it. And the source points out two very specific, tangible ways to tune your ear to those high-frequency notes. Food and transit.
The two best entry points.
It makes this incredibly profound statement that food is not just daily sustenance. It is history shaped by geography.
It's edible anthropology.
Edible anthropology,
Yeah.
Yes. It lists these iconic pairings: pasta and pizza in Italy, sushi and ramen in Japan, tacos and burritos in Mexico, spicy curries in India. But it's not just a restaurant menu.
No, it's a story.
Right. When you eat sushi in Japan, you are directly internalizing the physical reality of an island nation that had extremely limited arable land and was forced to turn to the ocean for survival. When you eat a corn-based taco in Mexico, you are actively participating in a thousands of years old agricultural legacy that was specifically adapted to an arid climate.
You are quite literally consuming the history and the climate of the culture in one bite. The complex spices in an Indian curry literally map out ancient global trade routes. When you eat local food, you are tasting the geographical destiny of the people.
And local transit operates in the exact same way. The source highlights the cultural machinery of movement.
How a city moves tells you everything about it.
It really does. Riding a gondola through the slow, sinking history of Venice, feeling the chaotic, heart-pounding pulse of an Indian city from the open back of a rickshaw, experiencing the hyper-efficient, silent, almost sterile future of Japan on a bullet train, or weaving through the thick exhaust and raw energy of Southeast Asia in a tuk-tuk.
Because when you step onto local transit, you immediately stop being a spectator who is just looking at a city through a clean pane of glass, and you become a forced participant in its circulatory system.
You're in the bloodstream.
Exactly. You are subjected to the exact same frustrating delays, the exact same crushing crowds, and the exact same unwritten rules of social etiquette as the locals. You share their reality for a moment.
The text pushes this idea of participation even further. It strongly suggests engaging with the natural environment like snorkeling in a coral reef, skiing down a local mountain, or going on a safari. And deeply engaging with the social environment like staying in a family homestay, watching traditional local dances, or visiting the actual workshops of local artisans.
It's all about making the transition from merely consuming a prepackaged experience to actively engaging with a living culture. And the source brilliantly recommends two methods for anchoring these incredibly fleeting experiences: photography and, crucially, maintaining a travel journal.
Taking the time to actually write down your impressions.
Yes, because that state of hyper-awareness we discussed earlier, it creates a massive overflow of memory. You are taking in so much raw data that the brain literally cannot store it all. A journal forces you to synthesize the chaos. It forces you to articulate the high-frequency notes you are hearing before they inevitably fade away.
But here's the harsh reality of chasing those high-frequency notes. When you deliberately step away from the sanitized, heavily curated areas that were built specifically for tourists, when you try to ride the local commuter bus or eat at the grimy neighborhood market, you inevitably collide with the friction of the real world.
Oh, absolutely. The training wheels come on.
You step off the guided path, and you fall headfirst into what the source outlines as the crucible of challenges.
The romanticized, glossy veneer of travel is stripped away very, very quickly when you actually immerse yourself.
It is. The source provides a pretty comprehensive list of these vulnerabilities. The language barrier is always the most immediate one.
It's so isolating.
The profound, desperate isolation of trying to just ask for simple directions or read a critical warning sign when you literally don't even recognize the alphabet.
Yeah.
And then, of course, getting hopelessly, genuinely lost.
Or dealing with massive transportation delays that completely shatter your carefully constructed, beautiful itinerary. Being stuck on an overcrowded train for hours.
The sheer unpredictability of weather. You travel thousands of miles and spend thousands of dollars for a perfect beach day, and a monsoon hits. You plan a mountain hike, and a freak blizzard rolls in.
Mother Nature does not care about your vacation days.
She does not. Then there was budget stress, that awful mid-trip panic when you look at your bank app and realize you have bled through your funds way faster than you anticipated.
That's a terrible feeling.
And the dark cloud of health and safety concerns. Getting violently, horribly ill from drinking tap water your body simply isn't adapted to, or suffering an extreme, unyielding heat, or dealing with the deep personal violation of encountering pickpockets in a crowded public square.
Every single one of these challenges represents a total failure of your usual protective layers.
Protective layers.
Yeah. At home, you have money, you speak the language fluently, you know how the medical system works, you have your own car, you are heavily insulated from the world. Travel systematically strips away every single piece of that insulation until you are left completely exposed to the elements.
The source also dives into the subtler, but honestly equally potent challenges of cultural differences. It discusses the actual physical discomfort of navigating foreign social norms.
Right, the things you do without thinking at home that are suddenly wrong.
Exactly. Examples like suddenly realizing you must remove your shoes before entering a home or a temple, or the custom of eating a full meal entirely with your hands instead of using any utensils.
See, those aren't just quirky little local customs for a tourist to giggle at. They are profound psychological hurdles.
How so?
When you remove your shoes, or when you are forced to abandon your utensils, you are being forced to physically submit to the rules of the culture you are visiting. You're actively relinquishing your deep-seated lifelong habits. It creates a very real feeling of vulnerability, but it is the exact mechanical process through which genuine humility and respect are learned.
The source attempts to frame all of this adversity, the lost bags, the sickness, the confusion, as the positive. It argues that delays teach patience. It suggests that taking a wrong turn and getting profoundly lost is actually an amazing opportunity because it might lead you to discover a hidden cafe or a quiet park that no tourist ever sees.
It fundamentally frames the obstacle as the path itself.
Okay, I have to stop right here. I need to push back on this pretty hard because I honestly think the travel industry peddles a massive, toxic lie about this whole concept.
Oh, all right, I'm listening. Tell me.
We read all these beautifully curated travel blogs and memoirs that insist over and over that getting lost is part of the adventure. But let's be totally honest with each other. When you are actually lost in the freezing, pouring rain in a sketchy neighborhood where you do not speak a single word of the language, your offline maps have completely failed, your phone battery is blinking at 2%, and you have absolutely no idea how to get back to your hotel.
Yes.
It is not an adventure. It is sheer, unadulterated misery. It is terrifying. Isn't this whole narrative of the romantic beauty of getting lost just a massive psychological trick we play on ourselves? Are we just basically gaslighting ourselves into enjoying deep distress so we don't feel like we completely wasted our vacation money?
Well, that is a highly cynical, but honestly incredibly accurate description of the real-time experience.
Thank you. It's awful in the moment.
In the exact precise moment that you are lost in the freezing rain, you are right. It is not an adventure. It is a genuine crisis. Your cortisol levels are spiking through the roof. You are in a state of primal biological distress. But I will argue forcefully that the narrative of growth you're talking about is not a trick.
It's not.
No, it is the core functional mechanism of human resilience.
Okay, you have to explain how freezing in the rain builds resilience.
It's not the freezing that builds it, it's the extraction.
The extraction.
Yes. Think about the neurochemistry of what happens next in that scenario. You are stripped of all your normal tools. You can't rely on your language skills. You can't rely on your phone, and your usual safety nets are gone. But you still have to survive. You still have to get back to the hotel. So your brain adapts. You figure out a way to communicate with a random shop owner using nothing but desperate hand gestures and a crumpled paper map. You manage to navigate a highly complex underground transit system using only contextual visual clues and raw pattern recognition. You extract yourself from the crisis using nothing but your own raw intuition.
You solve the puzzle.
And when you finally solve that puzzle, when you walk back through the doors of your hotel dripping wet, your brain absolutely floods with dopamine and serotonin. The biological reward mechanism is massive.
Oh, wow.
You prove to yourself on a deep visceral level that you are fully capable of surviving the unknown. When you successfully navigate pure adversity in a totally foreign environment, you build an unshakable foundational confidence that you simply cannot ever acquire sitting in the safety of your own living room.
You realize you are much harder to break than you thought you were.
Exactly. The source makes this brilliant distinction between a tourist and a traveler. A tourist expects the foreign environment to bend to their needs.
They want everyone to speak English and have an American menu.
Right. But a traveler bends themselves to fit the environment. The struggle, the intense friction, the acute misery of being lost. It isn't a glitch in the vacation. It is the literal exposure therapy that forces the transformation.
That is incredibly profound. The struggle is the exposure therapy. You don't realize you are changing while you are shivering in the rain, but your internal wiring is actively being rewritten.
It is. And the truly fascinating part is that you usually don't even realize the wiring has been rewritten until you undergo the absolute final phase of the journey.
Which is the return,
Yes.
the journey back home, and the inevitable collision with the altered self. The source text beautifully captures the deeply complex, messy cocktail of emotions that hits you on the final day of a trip.
It's a heavy day.
It is. You feel a deep happiness reflecting on all the experiences. But there's also a profound, heavy sadness that the suspended reality of the adventure is finally ending. And if we were being totally honest, there's a very real, very heavy sense of relief.
Oh, the relief is huge. It's the biological relief of knowing you are finally returning to your established predictive models. You are returning to a place where you know exactly how to order your coffee.
The text mentions the little rituals of departure too. Taking one last, slow walk through the main town square. Visiting that tiny neighborhood cafe, you finally figured out how to order from one last time.
Saying goodbye to the temporary life.
Exactly. And then the physical transition of the journey home begins. Sitting in the airport terminal, endlessly scrolling through the hundreds of photos on your phone, trying to organize the sheer chaos of the last few weeks into some kind of coherent narrative.
And then you land. You get your bags, you hail a taxi, you walk up to your house and put your key in the front door. And this is exactly where the source touches on the most jarring, disorienting psychological phenomenon of all travel: reverse culture shock.
Let's really examine this closely, because the source points out this incredibly bizarre paradox. You arrive home, you walk inside, and the physical environment is completely unchanged.
Nothing has moved.
The furniture is exactly where you left it. The specific smell of the hallway is identical. The dust is exactly the same. But you, the observer, have fundamentally mutated.
It is an incredibly surreal, almost out-of-body experience.
It really is.
You step into your own kitchen, an environment you know better than literally anywhere else on planet Earth. But the lens through which you are viewing it has been entirely recalibrated.
You're calibrated by the trip.
Yes. For the past 2 or 3 weeks, your brain has been locked in a state of hyper-awareness, constantly analyzing every building, every local custom, and every single social interaction as a fascinating anthropological study. And when you walk through your front door, your brain doesn't just immediately turn that hyper-awareness off.
It's still running the software. The text actually notes that travelers start noticing the architecture of their own hometowns completely differently. They suddenly appreciate ordinary, boring comforts, like the feeling of their own mattress or the taste of highly familiar basic foods with completely fresh, almost alien eyes.
Your hometown suddenly feels like a foreign country. You go to your local grocery store, a place you've been 1,000 times, and you suddenly feel like an alien anthropologist observing human beings engaging in the strange local ritual of purchasing breakfast cereal.
It's so trippy. But why does that happen? Why does the most familiar place in the world suddenly become alien?
Because Travel completely strips your hometown of its monopoly on reality.
Monopoly on reality.
Wow. When you live your whole life in one place, your brain naturally assumes that your specific way of life is the default human setting. It is the unquestioned absolute normal. But when you fully immerse yourself in a foreign culture, you realize viscerally that your normal is just one highly specific option among thousands of valid options.
It shatters the illusion.
It does. So when you return home, your brain instinctively applies that new outsider's perspective to your own life. You see your daily commute, your societal rules, your architecture not as the absolute universal truth of existence, but merely as the quirky local customs of the culture you just happen to have been born into.
It permanently demotes your reality from the truth to a perspective. That is huge. And the source explores how this destabilization impacts your long-term trajectory as a person. It talks about the aftermath of travel, sitting down at a bar with your friends and sharing the stories.
And you have to notice which stories actually survive the trip.
Yes, that's my favorite part. The text explicitly points out that the funniest, most memorable stories you tell aren't about how perfectly you folded your shirts or how the flight was right on time.
No one wants to hear about a smooth flight.
No. The stories you tell over and over are the mishaps. The time you got hopelessly lost in the freezing rain. The time you accidentally ordered a massive plate of fermented fish because you confidently pointed at the completely wrong word on a menu.
The struggles literally become your narrative trophies. You display them to your friends to prove you survived the crucible.
And the sharing of those trophies, the source notes, inevitably sparks the desire to pack the bag and do it all over again. But the ultimate takeaway from the text goes way beyond just booking another flight. It argues that the true, lasting legacy of travel is that it inspires lifelong learning.
This is where the internal transformation becomes permanent.
The source states that travelers return home and suddenly find themselves wanting to study a new language, or they develop this sudden, intense interest in global history, or they start watching documentaries about international cooking. The deep curiosity that was forced upon them by the foreign environment just continues to burn long after they are safely back in their living room.
Because travel systematically dismantles the arrogance of ignorance.
The arrogance of ignorance.
Yes. When you stay in one place your whole life, it is incredibly easy to arrogantly believe you understand exactly how the world works. But when you travel, you are constantly, relentlessly confronted by the sheer vastness of human experience.
You see how small you are.
You see entirely different systems of morality, different definitions of what happiness means, entirely different ways of organizing a society. It proves to you undeniably how incredibly little you actually know. And for a curious mind, that realization isn't intimidating, it is an invitation.
It's an invitation to view the entire world as an endless curriculum. Every single journey is just another step toward discovering more about the complexity of life, the resilience of other people, and ultimately the boundaries of yourself.
It's the ultimate education.
It really is. Well, we have covered immense ground today. We really mapped out the complete anatomy of a journey. We started all the way back at the threshold of the driveway, examining how we use idioms of readiness to construct this fragile illusion of control, only to have our biology immediately rebel at the very first 10-minute pit stop.
We analyzed the whole architecture of preparation, realizing that all those visas, the baggage limits, the offline maps, they are not a prison of scheduling, but the necessary scaffolding that allows true, safe spontaneity to exist in the first place.
We drifted through the quiet liminal space of transit, existing as suspended packages in the non-places of airplanes and trains, before crashing violently into the massive sensory overload and the exhausting neuroplasticity of arrival.
We bypassed the performative giant monuments to seek out the actual acoustic resonance of a city, finding its true history baked right into its street food and the chaos of its local transit.
We faced the crucible of challenges, totally reframing the absolute misery of getting lost and the friction of cultural differences as the very exposure therapy that builds human resilience, transforming us from demanding tourists into adaptable travelers.
And finally, we endured reverse culture shock. We returned to our perfectly unchanged familiar homes, only to realize that our own internal lens had been permanently recalibrated, turning our own mundane reality into just another fascinating culture to observe.
And all of this incredible, profound psychological mapping was hiding quietly inside a C2 English listening practice lesson.
It's incredible.
It really proves that the physical logistics of travel, the zipping of the suitcase, the boarding of the plane, are ultimately trivial. The actual journey is the psychological dismantling and rebuilding of your entire worldview.
It's the only reason we actually do it.
Exactly. And as we close this deep dive out, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to carry with you before you zip up your suitcase for your next departure.
Let's hear it.
We established today that every single journey fundamentally alters your brain. It recalibrates your lens, it strips your hometown of its monopoly on reality, and it grants you the superpower of an outsider's perspective. But if that is true, if every trip makes your own home feel a little bit more like a foreign country, are you ever truly home again once you start traveling?
Oh, that's heavy.
Or does the act of exploration scatter tiny pieces of your identity across the globe, requiring you to just keep moving, to keep seeking out new horizons, just to feel whole?
That's something to think about on your next flight.
It definitely is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Approach your next trip, whether you are crossing an ocean or just driving to the next town over, not as a simple vacation, but as a genuine opportunity for transformation. We will see you next time. Have you ever found yourself just completely unequivocally trapped in the passenger seat of a car?
Oh, I think we all have.
Right. Like you're sitting next to someone whose internal compass is clearly, perhaps tragically, broken.
Yes. It is a very specific kind of nightmare.
It really is.
Yeah.
Picture the scenario, because it is palpable. The highway signs are pointing in one direction, basic geometric logic is pointing in another, and, the little glowing screen on the dashboard actively pleading with you to execute a U-turn.
Desperately pleading.
Exactly. And yet the person behind the wheel is just gripping the leather like a 19th century sea captain going down with a sinking ship. Find confidence.
Yeah.
Or consider a slightly different phenomenon. You're driving down a long, just seemingly endless stretch of highway.
Right, staring at the horizon.
Yeah, you've been staring at that vanishing point for hours. And suddenly you feel this overwhelming primal urge to pull over just to see something utterly absurd.
Like the world's largest ball of twine.
Yes, a giant ball of twine. If you, the listener, have experienced either of these incredibly specific, strangely universal scenarios, you are not alone. And today, we are going to figure out the architectural, psychological, and linguistic reasons why we do these things.
It really is a profoundly shared human experience. I mean, the physical confinement of a moving vehicle combined with the psychological stretch of the open road, it induces states of mind that we rarely encounter in our stationary lives.
We really do behave differently in cars.
We absolutely do. And consequently, we speak differently about them.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because our source material for today is wildly unexpected.
It's definitely not what you'd typically expect for a sociological breakdown.
No, not at all. We aren't analyzing a psychological journal or like a peer-reviewed sociological study on confined spaces.
Right, or geographical survey.
Exactly. We are actually analyzing a transcript from a C2 Advanced English Listening Practice show. It's hosted by two instructors, John and Emma.
Which is fascinating on its own.
It is. On the surface, if you just glance at the text, this is just a language lesson meant to teach high-level English learners a few vocabulary words and idioms about travel.
Just a standard educational tool.
But looking closely at the subtext, I'm just struck by how much more is happening here. Our mission today is to dig into this specific lesson and uncover the hidden cultural architecture of the North American road trip.
And the psychology of that confinement.
Yes, the intense, almost hostage-like psychology of being trapped in a moving metal box with another human being.
It really can feel like a hostage situation sometimes.
It really can. And we want to see how our literal physical journeys shape the abstract idioms we use to communicate every single day. I mean, how does a simple English lesson reveal so much about human nature?
Well, it serves as a perfect mirror, honestly, because language is never just a sterile collection of vocabulary words.
Right, it's not just a dictionary.
Exactly. Language is the ultimate residue of culture. When Emma and John are teaching these idioms to their listeners, they're not just handing over a rote list of definitions to memorize for some exam.
They're doing way more than that.
They are inadvertently providing a fascinating window into how physical landscapes actually shape our cultural expectations.
And our interpersonal relationships too, right?
Yes, and our cognitive framing. When you analyze their source material at a granular level, you realize that it is entirely impossible to separate the idioms of a culture from the physical geography of the place where that culture developed.
That is such a wild concept.
The words we use are literally born from the dirt, the asphalt, and the distances we traverse.
That concept, the residue of culture, it provides such a powerful lens for the very first part of their lesson.
It really sets the stage.
Emma sets up this incredible contrast right out of the gate that I want to explore. John prompts her about the culture behind road trips, noting that in many parts of the world, getting in a car and driving for 3 days just isn't a common leisure activity.
It's actually quite unique to certain regions.
Yeah. Emma immediately points to North America, specifically the US and Canada, and attributes this phenomenon to the vast, almost incomprehensible distances.
And the massive national parks.
Right. She talks about the unique sense of freedom you get from just getting in a car and driving into the horizon. And John contrasts this with Europe, pointing out that it's often significantly easier, faster, and just more logical to take a high-speed train.
The geography over there just doesn't demand those wide-open highways stretching for hours and hours across nothingness.
It's a completely different landscape.
Which is a profound geographical distinction that fundamentally alters the philosophical approach to travel in those respective regions.
How so?
Well, in Europe, as John notes, the train system is highly developed. It's efficient and meticulously designed to connect densely populated, centuries-old urban centers.
Right. Everything is much closer together.
Exactly. The geography is relatively compact. Therefore, the primary goal of travel is utility and efficiency. The objective is simply to move a human body from point A to point B with minimal friction.
Just get there as fast as possible.
But in North America, the sheer staggering scale of the landmass, the thousands of miles of open, undeveloped space between the coasts, it forces a completely different psychological relationship with the concept of travel.
It has to, right? You can't just hop on a 2-hour train.
No, you can't. It becomes less about efficient point-to-point transit and more about endurance. And when a culture is faced with the necessity of endurance, it eventually romanticizes that endurance into an experience of freedom.
That is so interesting. I'm looking at Europe's train networks versus America's endless highways, and I can't help but wonder about the chicken and the egg here.
It's a classic debate.
Right. Did the sheer size of the North American landscape force its citizens to invent the philosophy of the road trip as a coping mechanism? Or did they aggressively build out that massive interstate highway system because there was already a cultural obsession with the romance of the frontier?
That's a great way to frame it.
Because to me, the European train model is basically a teleportation device.
A teleportation device. I like that.
Yeah, think about it. Your entire goal is to get in, sit down, maybe read a book, completely ignore the blur outside the window, and then step out in a completely new city.
The travel itself is incidental.
Exactly. It's just a waiting room for your actual vacation. But the American car trip, the car is a moving living room.
A moving living room. That's a very accurate description.
The travel isn't the waiting room for the event. The travel is the event.
It is a symbiotic relationship between geography and cultural identity, really.
Yeah.
To address your question, the landscape presented a formidable barrier, but the cultural response to that barrier was uniquely American.
So the landscape dictated the response.
In many ways, yes. When the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 authorized the construction of the interstate highway system, it wasn't just laying down asphalt.
What was it doing?
It was laying down a continuous, unified stage for the American mythos. When you are faced with a grueling 3-day drive across relatively empty terrain like the Great Plains, you have a psychological choice.
You can go crazy or you can embrace it.
Exactly. You can either view it as a form of torture, a massive punishing barrier preventing you from reaching your destination,
Which sounds awful.
or you can reframe it as a romantic adventure. The culture chose to reframe it. They transformed the vehicle from a mere utility cart into a domestic sanctuary, your moving living room.
That makes so much sense.
And you see the psychological reframing and the specific, almost ritualistic examples Emma gives in the lesson.
Like the playlists and the games.
Yes, she talks about people making highly curated music playlists, playing specific car games to pass the time, and purposefully stopping at quirky roadside attractions.
Okay, those quirky roadside attractions are what really trip me up. Emma specifically mentions stopping to see the world's largest ball of twine.
A classic staple.
And pulling over at a diner shaped like a giant hot dog. I mean, think about the logical absurdity of that behavior.
It defies pure logic, certainly.
You are traveling hundreds of miles. You have a specific destination you are ostensibly trying to reach, and yet you willingly decide to delay your own progress, burn extra fuel, and extend your confinement just to look at a literal ball of string.
It does sound bizarre when you lay it out like that.
Why on earth do we do that? What compels a rational human to stop for a giant hot dog?
We do it because human cognition is not designed to process endless, unchanging voids.
Our brains just can't handle the nothingness.
Precisely. When you are sitting in that moving living room, traversing vast expanses of geological monotony, your brain requires punctuation.
Punctuation. I love that.
You desperately need something to break the hypnotic, sensory-depriving thrum of the highway. These monuments to quirkiness, the giant hot dog diners, the concrete dinosaurs, the enormous balls of twine, they serve as vital psychological waypoints.
So they aren't just tourist traps.
No, they are not merely cynical tourist traps designed to separate travelers from their money. They are existential anchors.
Existential anchors.
Well, they offer proof of life in the middle of nowhere. They give the journey texture and narrative rhythm.
They give you something to talk about.
Exactly. More importantly, they provide shared, novel memories for the people confined in the car, which retroactively justifies the massive amount of time spent sitting in silence together.
So they are psychological survival tools.
Essentially, yes.
Making a playlist,
Yeah.
playing I Spy, looking at a giant bowl of twine. These aren't just fun little vacation activities. They are necessary cognitive interventions.
To keep you from losing your mind.
Right. To keep you from losing your mind while staring at a dashed white line on asphalt for 12 hours straight.
It's a coping mechanism.
And if the travel is the actual event, if the car is essentially a mobile fortress against the void, then preparing to leave that fortress requires a very specific mindset.
Which leads us to the vocabulary they use.
Exactly. Which leads me to how we actually talk about this. The language Emma and John use to describe getting in the car isn't relaxed. It's incredibly intense.
What's fascinating here is how visceral, physical, and action-oriented the vocabulary of departure actually is.
It really is.
Before John and Emma even introduce their first new idiom, Emma recaps the previous lesson. She reminds her C2 learners of terms like munchies, pit stop, and ensuring they have got all our bases covered.
Right.
If you analyze those terms independently, they reveal a deep subconscious anxiety about the act of travel.
Let's pull those apart, starting with munchies. Because they aren't just meals.
No, they are very specific.
You don't pack a roast beef dinner or a delicate salad for the dashboard. Munchies are small, continuous, often highly processed snacks.
It's grazing behavior.
It's an oral fixation. It goes back to your point about pacing the boredom. You are literally chewing to mark the passage of time.
That's a great way to put it.
But the other two phrases, making a pit stop and having got all our bases covered, I find those deeply strange for a family vacation.
They are very intense metaphors.
Yeah, these are high-stakes sports metaphors, right?
Precisely. And the origin of those idioms is key to understanding the psychology. Pit stop comes directly from the world of professional auto racing.
Which is not relaxing at all.
It describes a moment where a high-performance machine pulls off the track for a rapid, highly coordinated, high-stress refueling and tire change.
Everyone rushing around the car.
Exactly. And bases covered comes from baseball, implying a comprehensive defensive strategy where every possible vulnerability on the field is anticipated and protected against.
So you're preparing for an attack.
By utilizing these specific idioms to describe something as mundane as packing up a station wagon for a weekend getaway, the English language elevates the road trip.
It really does. It sounds like going to war.
It subconsciously frames a leisure activity as a strategic, high-stakes, almost militaristic operation. It isn't just a relaxing drive. It's a mission that requires tactical planning and defensive foresight.
Wait, let me wrap my head around that. You're saying we unconsciously use high-speed racing terminology and defensive sports jargon to make a mundane family vacation feel like a critical mission?
That is exactly what we're doing.
Are we trying to convince ourselves the trip is exciting? Or are we just masking the underlying stress of hurling our bodies down a concrete corridor at 70 miles an hour?
I think it's largely the latter.
Because when you say pit stop, it implies speed. You aren't just taking a leisurely break to stretch your legs.
You are on a clock.
Yeah, you are a professional racing team executing a necessary maneuver so you can get back to the objective.
It is entirely about masking vulnerability through the illusion of hypercompetence. The language we use serves as an armor against the inherent chaos of the open road.
We need to feel like we are in control.
And this brings us to their first new idiom in the lesson, which Emma introduces as a classic staple of American English. Hit the road.
Oh, that's a great one.
John carefully explains to the listener that instead of saying, let's get going, native speakers will often say, it's getting late, we should hit the road.
It's everywhere.
He defines it simply as starting a journey or leaving. But look at the kinetic energy of that verb. Hit. It is violent. It is forceful.
It really is. Let's get going. It's so passive. It's a gentle, sort of collaborative suggestion.
They're mild.
But hit the road is an aggressive physical engagement with the landscape itself.
It's an attack.
It perfectly captures that initial burst of adrenaline, that almost aggressive optimism you feel right when you pull out of the driveway.
The caffeine is kicking in.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the moment when the romantic ideal of the road trip is at its absolute untarnished peak. You aren't just driving. You are conquering the distance.
It implies impact and momentum. When you hit the road, you are dominating the environment rather than letting the environment dictate your terms.
You are in charge.
However, the trajectory of any road trip dictates that this initial peak of kinetic optimism must eventually and inevitably degrade.
Oh, it degrades incredibly fast.
Usually within the first few hours.
Because almost immediately after they teach this aggressive, optimistic phrase, hit the road, Emma introduces the exact opposite end of the emotional spectrum.
The dreaded question.
The phrase, are we there yet? John defines this for the learners as the famous question every parent dreads, framing it as a slightly impatient way of asking if you have finally arrived at your destination.
That is the literal definition.
But I have to push back on John's definition here, or at least how simple he makes it sound. Is it truly just slightly impatient?
You think it's more than that.
Because anyone who has heard a kid ask this from the backseat, or anyone who remembers asking it themselves, knows it feels vastly heavier than mere impatience.
Oh, it carries a lot of weight.
I don't think, are we there yet? It is actually a question about geographical arrival. I think it is a child's verbal rebellion against the utter powerlessness of being trapped in the car.
I wouldn't dismiss John's definition entirely. I mean, on a purely functional linguistic level for an English learner, impatient inquiry about arrival is the correct denotation.
Sure, they need to know what it literally translates to.
The student needs to know what the words literally mean. But if we dig into the psychological connotation, your interpretation uncovers the deeper mechanism at play.
It's about agency, right?
Exactly. A child has absolutely zero agency in a vehicle. They did not choose the destination. They did not select the route. They are not operating the machinery.
They're just strapped in.
They are, for all intents and purposes, captive cargo in the adult's strategic operation.
Captive cargo. Wow.
When a child repeatedly asks, "Are we there yet?" they are expressing the fundamental underlying tension of the road trip.
They are voicing what everyone is feeling.
They are vocalizing the brutal clash between the abstract adult concept of freedom and the physical bodily reality of being strapped into a restrictive 5-point harness for 6 hours.
It's miserable.
They are mourning the loss of the romantic ideal.
It is the ultimate friction. You start the morning by forcefully, optimistically hitting the road with all this aggressive momentum.
The conquering hero.
And within 2 hours, you're reduced to a whimpering, "Are we there yet?"
Yeah.
Because the reality of the void is setting in.
The nothingness takes over.
The romance of the open window and the wind in your hair has slammed headfirst into the reality of eating stale munchies and staring at the back of a gray fabric headrest.
It's a harsh reality check.
And this tension, this inevitable agonizing friction between the expectation of the journey and the reality of the confinement, it perfectly sets the stage for the audio dialogue John and Emma play next.
It's a brilliant transition.
They transition into a clip of a couple who are actively driving, and frankly, it is a masterclass in the psychology of the cockpit.
The dialogue they present to their students is incredibly dense with subtext.
Walk us through what happens.
In the clip, the woman expresses growing doubt about their location. She states she doesn't recognize the area, and she explicitly points out that the digital GPS is indicating they should have turned off the main highway 20 minutes ago.
A completely objective fact.
Right. She finally states clearly and unambiguously, "I think we're lost."
The dreaded words.
And the male driver's response is a fascinating, almost textbook study in cognitive dissonance and denial.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because his response isn't just denial, it's an elaborate philosophical defense.
He really digs in.
He says, of course it's the right way. Relax. I know what I'm doing. Look at the beautiful scenery.
Deflecting immediately.
And when she pushes back specifically about the GPS, he openly attacks the machine. He says the GPS is wrong, that these machines are never 100% reliable, and he insists that he relies on his internal compass.
His mythical internal compass.
Let's pause right there. The internal compass. That isn't an actual navigational tool. Human beings do not have magnetic lodestones in our brains like migratory birds.
No, we certainly do not.
The internal compass is purely an ego protection shield. But why? Why is it that in the confined space of a car, the simple act of admitting a wrong turn feels equivalent to a profound, devastating personal failure?
To understand that, we have to look at how driving, especially in the context of the highly romanticized North American road trip, is historically tethered to concepts of pioneering.
Like the original settlers.
Yes. Pioneering, self-reliance, and masculine mastery over the environment. To be the driver is to assume the role of the captain of the ship.
You are the leader.
You are explicitly entrusted with the physical safety and the forward progress of your passengers. Wayfinding, historically and evolutionarily, is a demonstration of extreme competence.
It proves you can provide and protect.
Therefore, to admit that you are lost is to admit that you have failed in your primary evolutionary duty as the leader of the expedition.
Wow. So it's not just about a road.
No, you haven't just made a geographical error. You have revealed a flaw in your core competence.
Which explains his sheer hostility toward the GPS.
Yeah.
The introduction of satellite navigation fundamentally threatened this entire historical dynamic. Before the GPS existed, a driver could easily bluff their way out of a mistake.
You could just keep driving until you found a sign.
Right. They could wander aimlessly down a dirt road, pretend they meant to do it, and claim they were intentionally taking a scenic route.
The old scenic route excuse.
But the GPS destroys that ambiguity. It provides objective, undeniable, mathematically precise proof of failure.
It is the ultimate unbiased auditor of competence.
An auditor. That's terrifying.
It sits on the dashboard, completely devoid of emotion, coldly recalculating and publicly broadcasting your errors to everyone in the cabin.
It literally says recalculating. It's so shameful.
The cognitive dissonance becomes unbearable for the driver. He is forced to choose between admitting his own human fallibility or denying the objective reality of a satellite network.
And he chooses to fight the satellite.
To protect his ego, the man in the dialogue is forced to attack the machine. He has to utter the absurd phrase, "These things are never 100% reliable," in an attempt to elevate his own flawed human intuition, his mystical internal compass above literal astrophysics.
Above astrophysics. And his tactic of pointing out the scenery is so incredibly transparent. Look at the beautiful scenery.
It's a classic misdirection.
He actively weaponizes the very romantic ideal of the road trip that Emma talked about earlier. He uses it to distract his passenger from his total navigational failure.
He's desperate.
It's a verbal sleight of hand. It's a magician's misdirection. He is basically screaming, "Don't look at the flashing red screen telling us we are 20 miles off course. Look at that majestic pine tree."
It is a classic, albeit desperate, deflection strategy. He is attempting in real time to reframe a glaring navigational error as an intentional, curated experiential choice.
We meant to do this.
He is implicitly arguing to his partner, "We aren't lost, we are simply exploring."
Oh, that's good.
He is trying to force the European model of efficiency back into the American model of romantic wandering.
But his passenger is not buying it.
No, the woman in the dialogue is completely immune to this. She immediately pierces his ego protection shield using highly effective sarcasm.
I love her response.
She reminds him that the last time he relied on his mythical internal compass, they ended up in a completely different state.
A completely different state. Which perfectly highlights this deeply irrational human tendency to double down on our mistakes, rather than just concede to the little glowing box.
We will go to great lengths to avoid admitting we are wrong.
This guy would literally rather drive across state lines, burning hours of time and gallons of gas, than admit the machine was right. And this brings up the ultimate power dynamic of the road trip.
Because the threat isn't just the machine.
Right, because the driver's fragile ego isn't just threatened by the technology mounted on the dashboard. It's threatened by the breathing, observing human being sitting in the passenger seat.
The witness.
The witness to the failure. Which leads John and Emma to teach their next crucial vocabulary word. The backseat driver.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sociological concept of the backseat driver perfectly encapsulates the terrifying asymmetrical power dynamic that exists inside a moving vehicle.
It is terrifying when you think about it.
John provides the standard definition for his learners. A backseat driver is a passenger who gives the driver unwanted advice, such as telling them to slow down, pointing out hazards, or criticizing a missed turn.
And in the audio clip, right after the man stubbornly refuses to pull over and check the map, the woman mutters to herself in pure exasperation.
She's had enough.
She says, "I knew I should have driven. You're such a terrible backseat driver when I'm at the wheel, but you won't take any advice yourself." It's such an incredibly relatable, highly specific moment of marital tension.
We've all been there.
But I hear the term backseat driver used almost exclusively as a pejorative. It's an insult. It's always framed as the passenger being utterly annoying and disruptive.
It's rarely a compliment.
So what does this all mean? I want to challenge the purely negative connotation here. Because if the driver is operating on a delusional internal compass, actively ignoring satellite data, and aggressively getting them lost across state lines, isn't the so-called backseat driver actually just being a rational survivor trying to prevent a disaster?
That is a highly perceptive reading of the sociology of the car. It requires us to look at who created the term.
Who did create it?
The phrase backseat driver was undoubtedly coined by drivers. It functions as a powerful linguistics tool utilized by the person holding all the power to delegitimize the valid concerns of the person holding no power.
Oh, wow.
Consider the physics and the physical reality of the passenger situation. They are hurtling through space at 70 miles per hour in a 2-ton heavy machine.
A death trap, basically.
In the event of a catastrophic accident, they bear exactly the same physical risk, the exact same bodily vulnerability as the driver.
Their life is on the line too.
Yet they possess absolutely zero mechanical control over their own fate. They do not have a steering wheel to alter course. They do not have a brake pedal to stop. They do not have an accelerator.
They're just sitting there.
They are physically powerless. Their only available tool for self-preservation is their voice.
Right. It's basically a hostage situation with cup holders.
That's a very vivid way to describe it.
You are physically strapped in, locked in a metal box, and your continued existence on this earth is entirely in the hands of someone who arrogantly thinks they possess better spatial awareness than a multi-billion-dollar military satellite network.
It's absurd when you lay it out.
Of course you're going to give advice. You're trying to survive.
Exactly. But from the driver's perspective, and we must acknowledge the intense cognitive load required to operate a vehicle safely at high speeds, any verbal input from a passenger feels like an assault on their concentration and their authority.
Because they're already stressed.
When the passenger attempts to exert the only influence they have by offering verbal advice, the driver immediately dismisses them with this pejorative label. You're just being a backseat driver.
It just shuts them down entirely.
It is a rhetorical defense mechanism. It allows the driver to maintain absolute autocratic authority over the vehicle and deflect any accountability, even when they are actively and demonstrably making dangerous mistakes.
That's so unfair.
The woman's muttered frustration in the dialogue perfectly highlights the blatant hypocrisy of this dynamic. The man happily plays the oppressive role of the backseat driver when she is driving, exerting relentless verbal control when he lacks physical control, but he fiercely refuses to accept any input whatsoever when he holds the wheel.
It is just a fantastic piece of writing by John and Emma, or at least a brilliant curation of a highly realistic scenario.
It feels very real.
And we have to take a second to step back and point out the absolute pedagogical brilliance of their lesson structure here. Remember, they are teaching C2 Advanced English.
The highest level.
This is the highest level of language mastery. They could have easily just read a dry, sterile list of dictionary definitions into microphones.
Like a standard textbook.
They could have just said, a backseat driver is a passenger who gives unwanted advice. To hit the road means to leave. But instead of doing that, they anchor this complex vocabulary in a highly relatable, deeply frustrating, and incredibly emotionally charged human interaction.
The marital spat.
A literal marital spat playing out in a car. By tying these idioms to this high emotional resonance, they make it exponentially easier for a language learner to actually retain the information.
You remember the emotion.
You don't just remember the sterile definition on a flashcard. You remember the arrogant, stubborn guy aggressively ignoring the GPS and his completely defeated, frustrated partner muttering angrily under her breath.
They are heavily utilizing the concept of episodic memory in their teaching methodology.
What's episodic memory?
Well, human beings are fundamentally narrative creatures. We remember stories, conflicts, and emotional arcs far better than we remember abstract concepts or isolated data points.
We love drama.
Exactly. By embedding the vocabulary within a narrative of conflict, John and Emma give the words a tactile reality. However, the intense emotional and spatial tension inside that car requires a resolution.
It can't go on forever.
It requires a resolution both narratively for the couple and linguistically for the students. That mounting tension must eventually force a physical action.
Something has to give.
The forward momentum cannot continue indefinitely under that level of stress, which brings us to the final vocabulary words in their lesson. The words that literally and metaphorically bring the vehicle and the argument to a complete halt.
Yes, the breaking point. The woman finally gives up on debating the internal compass and issues a clear demand.
She puts her foot down.
She says, please just pull over so we can look at the map properly. And John comes in to explain to the listener that pull over means to intentionally move your car to the side of the road and bring it to a complete stop.
A simple physical action.
Right, he gives a few examples, mentioning that a police officer might turn on their sirens and tell you to pull over, or as in this case, you might pull over to safely check a map. But when you look at the context of their argument, even this simple physical act of steering the car to the shoulder carries an immense amount of psychological weight.
Because the act of pulling over in the context of this specific power struggle is an act of physical and psychological submission.
He is giving up.
We discussed earlier how the driver maintains authority. As long as the engine is running and the car is moving forward, the driver successfully maintains the illusion of progress and, more importantly, the illusion of control.
Motion equals control.
The motion itself is the defense mechanism. The exact moment he steers the car to the gravel shoulder, shifts into park, and stops the engine, that illusion completely shatters.
It's all over.
The journey is officially paused. The aggressive, optimistic momentum of hitting the road is entirely dead. By physically pulling over to check the digital map, he is publicly and officially conceding that his mythical internal compass has failed him.
Which explains exactly why he fights her request so hard in the audio. His response is so defensive.
He hates doing it.
He says, fine, but I'm telling you we're not lost. It's incredible. He is forced to yield the physical territory by literally pulling the car over, but he still absolutely refuses to yield the psychological territory.
He will not surrender the narrative.
He stops the car, but he won't stop the denial. And then once the audio clip ends, Emma comes back in as the instructor and uses this beautiful evocative phrase to summarize the entire messy situation.
She sums it up perfectly.
She says naturally and casually, well, it seems like their perfect road trip has hit a small bump in the road. John jumps on it immediately, explaining to the students that a bump in the road is a great idiom meaning a small problem or a temporary setback.
It is a stunning example of how incredibly tactile and sensory the English language can be.
A bump in the road.
The language has taken a literal, highly physical sensation, the jarring, uncomfortable bodily jolt of driving a heavy vehicle over uneven, poorly maintained pavement. A sensation that briefly disrupts your smooth forward progress.
It physically shakes you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it has abstracted that physical sensation into a universally understood metaphor for any minor, temporary difficulty in life.
We use it for everything.
Think about how broadly we apply this. A major project at work gets delayed by a week. We call it a bump in the road.
A romantic relationship experiences a minor, solvable disagreement. A bump in the road.
Exactly. We constantly map our physical, bodily experiences of navigating the physical world onto our invisible, emotional, and psychological landscape.
And there's this great meta layer to how they present it in the lesson, too.
How do you mean?
Emma doesn't announce it as a vocabulary word initially. She just naturally slips bump in the road into the casual conversation summarizing the audio.
She just uses it.
She just uses it organically. And when John stops her and points out that she's full of idioms today, she just laughs and says, it comes with the territory of language learning.
Which is another idiom.
Right. It proves that idioms are incredibly contagious. They just bleed into how we naturally speak because they are so much more effective at painting a vivid picture than literal language.
They are far more evocative.
Saying they encountered a temporary setback is sterile. Saying they hit a bump in the road instantly conveys a massive amount of contextual information.
It tells you exactly how to feel about the problem.
It tells us that the problem is annoying, it might shake you up a bit, but it is ultimately survivable. The car is still intact, and the journey will inevitably continue.
which serves to bring a highly comforting, necessary resolution to the mounting tension of the dialogue.
It de-escalates everything.
The situation with the stubbornly lost husband and the deeply frustrated wife isn't categorized as a catastrophic disaster. It is merely categorized as a bump in the road.
It frames human conflict as normal.
It frames human conflict not as an end state, but as an expected, manageable, and inevitable part of any shared journey. And from a strictly educational standpoint, John's concluding method for the lesson is highly effective.
I loved how he ended it.
After all this psychological exploration, he conducts a final audio review at the very end of the text.
Yes, the wrap-up. He tells the listener, listen to the meaning, then say the phrase out loud.
Rhythmic repetition.
And he goes through them rhythmically. An impatient question asked during a long journey. Are we there yet?
A passenger who gives unwanted advice. Backseat driver.
To start a journey? Hit the road. It's so crisp and efficient. They take this messy, emotionally charged, highly complex narrative about ego and spatial disorientation, and they brilliantly distill it back down into bite-sized, memorable definitions to perfectly solidify the learning.
It ties it all up nicely.
It acts as a perfect cognitive off-ramp for the listener.
By summarizing the complex narrative into these distinct, rhythmic linguistic markers, they allow the learner to cleanly categorize and store the heavy emotional experience right alongside the vocabulary.
It's so smart.
It is a highly sophisticated, pedagogically sound way to close out a C2 level lesson without leaving the student overwhelmed by the subtext.
It really is masterful teaching, and looking back at the journey we've just taken through this short transcript today, it is honestly amazing how much intellectual ground we've managed to cover from a simple vocabulary list.
We covered a lot of miles.
We started by examining the vast, highly romanticized, wide-open physical highways of North America, contrasting that philosophy with the teleportation-like communal efficiency of European train travel.
The landscape dictates the culture.
We unpack the subconscious anxiety of packing the car, loading up with continuous munchies, and treating our departure like a highly tactical, military-grade pit stop just so we could forcefully and optimistically hit the road.
The battle preparation.
We explored the existential dread and the utter lack of agency behind a child asking, "Are we there yet?" And then we navigated the incredibly fragile, historically burdened egos of drivers who rely on a mythical, non-existent internal compass just so they could ignore the cold, objective mathematical truth of a satellite GPS.
The great battle of man versus machine.
We unpack the hostage-like trauma and the asymmetrical power dynamics of the backseat driver, and finally, safely, pulled over after experiencing a few inevitable, highly tactile bumps in the road.
It functions as a comprehensive multidisciplinary tour of not just the vocabulary of travel, but the fundamental psychology of human movement and confinement.
Absolutely. And for you listening to this deep dive right now, I want you to really think about this conversation the next time you find yourself packing up the car for a trip.
Keep it in mind.
The next time you are sitting helplessly in the passenger seat, gripping the plastic armrest until your knuckles turn white, while the driver insists, against all available evidence, that they know a shortcut that is definitely taking you into a completely different state.
You'll know what's really happening.
You now possess the exact C2 level vocabulary and the psychological framework to accurately diagnose the breakdown happening in the driver's seat. You aren't just annoyed anymore. You are actively witnessing a profound clash between the romantic ideal of the open road and the terrifying, humiliating reality of a broken internal compass.
This raises an important, deeply provocative question, though, as we look away from the past and toward the future of transportation.
What's that?
We have spent this entire discussion analyzing how the physical, manual act of driving a car, gripping the steering wheel, scanning the open highway, bearing the heavy responsibility of navigation, has generated deep cultural idioms and powerful psychological archetypes over the last century.
It's all based on us driving.
Hitting the road, taking the wheel, the inherent power conflict of the backseat driver. These concepts are all entirely predicated on the requirement of a human being manually operating a heavy machine.
Right. Which is changing.
But we are rapidly, undeniably approaching an era of fully autonomous self-driving vehicles.
The computers are taking over.
If the car of the near future drives itself with perfect satellite precision, and every single person inside the vehicle becomes a passive passenger, what happens to this deeply ingrained language?
That is a wild thought.
Will the concept of the backseat driver completely cease to exist, Or will we simply find new, creative ways to verbally micromanage the algorithm?
Well, we will definitely yell at the algorithm.
How will our idioms of control, freedom, and travel fundamentally evolve when the moving living room truly becomes just a room that moves itself?
Wow. That completely flips the script.
Yeah.
If literally everyone is a passenger, who do we yell at when the car takes a route we don't like?
The machine, I suppose.
Do we start arguing with the car's AI? Do we accuse the central computer of having a broken internal compass?
It's very possible.
That is an incredible thought to end on. The physical landscape changes, the technology driving us changes, but the core human need to maintain the illusion of control over the journey, or at least complain loudly about it from the passenger seat, will probably just find a brand new set of idioms.
We always find a way to express our frustration.
We really do. Thank you so much for joining us on this excursion. It's always a genuine joy to uncover the deeper human stories hiding right inside the everyday language we take completely for granted.
It was a pleasure.
Until next time, keep your eyes on the road, trust your objective GPS over your fragile ego, and try to embrace the bumps along the way.